Everything you've ever wanted to know about Confucius, read in full from Wikipedia. Stick around to the end. Let's begin. Name. The name Confucius is a Latinized form of the Mandarin Chinese Confuzi, roughly meaning Great Master Kong or Wise Teacher Kong, that was coined in the late 16th century by early Jesuit missionaries to China. The more common name in Mandarin Chinese today is Kongzi, simply meaning Master Kong. Confucius's family name was Kong, O.C. Ka-ong, and his given name was Chu, O.C. K-wu. His courtesy name, a capping given at his coming-of-age ceremony, and by which he would have been known to all but his older family members, was Zhongni, O.C. N. Trung S. Nor J, the Zhong, indicating that he was the second son in his family. Life. Early life. It is thought that Confucius was born on 28 September 551 BCE in Zhu, in modern Khufu, Shandong. The area was notionally controlled by the kings of Zhou, but effectively independent under the local lords of Lu, who ruled from the nearby city of Khufu. His father, Kong He, or Shuliang He, was an elderly commandant of the local Lu garrison. His ancestry traced back through the dukes of Song to the Shang dynasty, which had preceded the Zhou. Traditional accounts of Confucius's life relate that Kong He's grandfather had migrated the family from Song to Lu. Not all modern scholars accept Confucius's descent from Song nobility. Kong He died when Confucius was 3 years old, and Confucius was raised by his mother, Yan Zhengzai, in poverty. His mother later died at less than 40 years of age. At age 19, he married Qi Guanxi, and a year later, the couple had their first child, their son, Kong Li. Qi Guan and Confucius later had 2 daughters together, one of whom is thought to have died as a child and one was named Kong Jiao. Confucius was educated at schools for commoners, where he studied and learned the 6 arts. Confucius was born into the class of Shai, between the aristocracy and the common people. He is said to have worked in various government jobs during his early 20s, and as a bookkeeper and a caretaker of sheep and horses, using the proceeds to give his mother a proper burial. When his mother died, Confucius, aged 23, is said to have mourned for 3 years, as was the tradition. Political career. In Confucius's time, the state of Lu was headed by a ruling ducal house. Under the duke were 3 aristocratic families, whose heads bore the title of Viscount and held hereditary positions in the Lu bureaucracy. The Ji family held the position Minister over the Masses, who was also the Prime Minister. The Meng family held the position Minister of Works, and the Shu family held the position Minister of War. In the winter of 505 BCE, Yang Hu, a retainer of the Ji family, rose up in rebellion and seized power from the Ji family. However, by the summer of 501 BCE, the 3 hereditary families had succeeded in expelling Yang Hu from Lu. By then, Confucius had built up a considerable reputation through his teachings, while the families came to see the value of proper conduct and righteousness, so they could achieve loyalty to a legitimate government. Thus, that year, 501 BCE, Confucius came to be appointed to the minor position of governor of a town. Eventually, he rose to the position of Minister of Crime. The Shunzi says that once assuming the post, Confucius ordered the execution of Xiaozheng Mao, another Lu state official and scholar, whose lectures attracted the 3,000 disciples several times except Yan Hui. Xiaozheng Mao was accused of 5 crimes, each worth execution, including concealed evilness, stubborn abnormality, eloquent duplicity, erudition in bizarre facts, and generosity to evildoers. Confucius desired to return the authority of the state to the duke by dismantling the fortifications of the city, strongholds belonging to the 3 families. This way, he could establish a centralized government. However, Confucius relied solely on diplomacy as he had no military authority himself. In 500 BCE, Hu Fan, the governor of Hu, revolted against his lord of the Shu family. Although the Meng and Shu families unsuccessfully besieged Hao, a loyalist official rose up with the people of Hou and forced Hao Fan to flee to the state of Qi. The situation may have been in favor for Confucius, as this likely made it possible for Confucius and his disciples to convince the aristocratic families to dismantle the fortifications of their cities. Eventually, after a year and a half, Confucius and his disciples succeeded in convincing the Shu family to raise the walls of Hou, the Ji family in raising the walls of Bi, and the Meng family in raising the walls of Cheng. First, the Shu family led an army towards their city Hao and tore down its walls in 498 BCE. Soon thereafter, Gongshan Furao, a retainer of the Ji family, revolted and took control of the forces at Bi. He immediately launched an attack and entered the capital Lu. Earlier, Gongshan had approached Confucius to join him, which Confucius considered as he wanted the opportunity to put his principles into practice, but he gave up on the idea in the end. Confucius disapproved the use of a violent revolution by principle, even though the Ji family dominated the Lu state by force for generations and had exiled the previous duke. Creel states that, unlike the rebel Yang Hu before him, Gongshan may have sought to destroy the three hereditary families and restore the power of the duke. However, Dubs is of the view that Gongshan was encouraged by Viscount Ji Huan to invade the Lu capital in an attempt to avoid dismantling the Bai-fortified walls. Whatever the situation may have been, Gongshan was considered an upright man who continued to defend the state of Lu, even after he was forced to flee. During the revolt by Gongshan, Zhongyu had managed to keep the duke and the three viscounts together at the court. Zhongyu was one of the disciples of Confucius, and Confucius had arranged for him to be given the position of governor by the Ji family. When Confucius heard of the raid, he requested that Viscount Ji Huan allow the duke and his court to retreat to a stronghold on his palace grounds. Thereafter, the heads of the three families and the duke retreated to the Ji's palace complex and ascended the Wuxi terrace. Confucius ordered 2 officers to lead an assault against the rebels. At least one of the 2 officers was a retainer of the Ji family, but they were unable to refuse the orders while in the presence of the duke, viscounts, and court. The rebels were pursued and defeated at Gu. Immediately after the revolt was defeated, the Ji family razed the Bai city walls to the ground. The attackers retreated after realizing that they would have to become rebels against the state and their lord. Through Confucius's actions, the Bai officials had inadvertently revolted against their own lord, thus forcing Viscount Ji Huan's hand in having to dismantle the walls of Bai, as it could have harbored such rebels, or confess to instigating the event by going against proper conduct and righteousness as an official. Dubs suggests that the incident brought to light Confucius's foresight, practical political ability, and insight into human character. When it was time to dismantle the city walls of the Meng family, the governor was reluctant to have his city walls torn down and convinced the head of the Meng family not to do so. The Zuozhuan recalls that the governor advised against razing the walls to the ground, as he said that it made Cheng vulnerable to qi and caused the destruction of the Meng family. Even though Viscount Meng Yi gave his word not to interfere with an attempt, he went back on his earlier promise to dismantle the walls. Later in 498 BCE, Duke Ding of Lu personally went with an army to lay siege to Cheng in an attempt to raze its walls to the ground, but he did not succeed. Thus, Confucius could not achieve the idealistic reforms that he wanted, including restoration of the legitimate rule of the duke. He had made powerful enemies within the state, especially with Viscount Ji Huan, due to his successes so far. According to accounts in the Zuozhuan and the records of the Grand Historian, Confucius departed his homeland in 497 BCE after his support for the failed attempt of dismantling the fortified city walls of the powerful Ji, Meng, and Shu families. He left the state of Lu without resigning, remaining in self-exile and unable to return as long as Viscount Ji Huan was alive. Exile. The Shiji stated that the neighboring Qi state was worried that Lu was becoming too powerful, while Confucius was involved in the government of the Lu state. According to this account, Qi decided to sabotage Lu's reforms by sending 100 good horses and 80 beautiful dancing girls to the Duke of Lu. The Duke indulged himself in pleasure and did not attend to official duties for 3 days. Confucius was disappointed and resolved to leave Lu and seek better opportunities. Yet to leave at once would expose the misbehavior of the Duke and therefore bring public humiliation to the ruler Confucius was serving. Confucius therefore waited for the Duke to make a lesser mistake. Soon after, the Duke neglected to send to Confucius a portion of the sacrificial meat that was his due according to custom, and Confucius seized upon this pretext to leave both his post and the Lu state. After Confucius's resignation, he traveled around the principality states of northeast and central China, including Wei, Song, Zheng, Chao, Chu, Qi, Chen, and Kai, and a failed attempt to go to Jin. At the courts of these states, He expounded his political beliefs, but did not see them implemented. Return home. According to the Zhuozhuan, Confucius returned home to his native Lu when he was 68, after he was invited to do so by Ji Kangxi, the chief minister of Lu. The Shiji depicts him spending his last years teaching 3,000 pupils, with 72 or 77 accomplished disciples that mastered the 6 arts. Meanwhile, Confucius dedicated himself in transmitting the old wisdom by writing or editing the 5 classics. During his return, Confucius sometimes acted as an advisor to several government officials in Lu, including Ji Kangxi, on matters including governance and crime. Burdened by the loss of both his son and his favorite disciples, he died at the age of 71 or 72 from natural causes. Confucius was buried on the bank of the Sishui River, to the north of Qufu City in Shandong Province. Starting as a humble tomb, the cemetery of Confucius had been expanded by emperors since the Han Dynasty. To date, the cemetery of Confucius covers an area of 183 hectares with more than 100,000 graves of the Kong descendants. It is included in the World Heritage List for its cultural and architectural value. Philosophy. In the Analects, Confucius presents himself as a transmitter who invented nothing. He puts the greatest emphasis on the importance of study, and it is the Chinese character for study that opens the text. Far from trying to build a systematic or formalist theory, he wanted his disciples to master and internalize older classics, so that they can capture the ancient wisdoms that promotes harmony and order, to aid their self-cultivation to become a perfect man. For example, the annals would allow them to relate the moral problems of the present to past political events. The Book of Odes reflects the mood and concerns of the commoners and their view on government, while the Book of Changes encompasses the key theory and practice of divination. Although some Chinese people follow Confucianism in a religious manner, many argue that its values are secular and that it is less a religion than a secular morality. Proponents of religious Confucianism argue that despite the secular nature of Confucianism's teachings, it is based on a worldview that is religious. Confucius was considered more of a humanist than a spiritualist. His discussions on afterlife and views concerning heaven remained indeterminate, and he is largely unconcerned with spiritual matters often considered essential to religious thought, such as the nature of souls, ethics. One of the deepest teachings of Confucius may have been the superiority of personal exemplification over explicit rules of behavior. His moral teachings emphasized self-cultivation, emulation of moral exemplars, and the attainment of skilled judgment rather than knowledge of rules. Confucian ethics may therefore be considered a type of virtue ethics. His teachings rarely rely on reasoned argument, and ethical ideals and methods are conveyed indirectly through allusion, innuendo, and even tautology. His teachings require examination and context to be understood. A good example is found in this famous anecdote. When the stables were burnt down on returning from court, Confucius said, "Was anyone hurt?" He did not ask about the horses. This remark was considered a strong manifestation of Confucius's advocacy in humanism. One of his teachings was a variant of the Golden Rule, sometimes called the Silver Rule, owing to its negative form, enbui. Zigong, a disciple, asked, "Is there any one word that could guide a person throughout life?" The master replied, "How about reciprocity? Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself." Often overlooked in Confucian ethics are the virtues to the self, sincerity, and the cultivation of knowledge. Virtuous action towards others begins with virtuous and sincere thought, which begins with knowledge. A virtuous disposition without knowledge is susceptible to corruption, and virtuous action without sincerity is not true righteousness. For Confucius, learning about ancient rituals, practices, music, social institutions, and relationship norms is both essential and the starting point for becoming a junzi. By learning, Confucius refers to moral cultivation that transforms a student into a superior man, rather than the mere accumulation of knowledge. The Confucian theory of ethics as exemplified in Li is based on 3 important conceptual aspects of life. A. Ceremonies associated with sacrifice to ancestors and deities of various types. B. Social and political institutions. And C. The etiquette of daily behavior. Some believed that Li originated from the heavens, but Confucius stressed the development of Li through the actions of sage leaders in human history. His discussions of Li seem to redefine the term to refer to all actions committed by a person to build the ideal society, rather than those conforming with canonical standards of ceremony. In the early Confucian tradition, Li was doing the proper thing at the proper time, balancing between maintaining existing norms to perpetuate an ethical social fabric and violating them in order to accomplish ethical good. Training in the Li of past sages cultivates virtues in people that include ethical judgment about when lie must be adapted in light of situational contexts. In Confucianism, the concept of Li is closely related to Yi, which is based upon the idea of reciprocity. Yi can be translated as righteousness, though it may mean what is ethically best to do in a certain context. The term contrasts with action done out of self-interest or profitableness. While pursuing one's own self-interest is not necessarily bad, one would be a better, more righteous person if one's life was based upon following a path designed to enhance the greater good. Thus, an outcome of Yi is doing the right thing for its own sake, without regarding the material gains. Just as action according to Li should be adapted to conform to the aspiration of adhering to Yi, so Yi is linked to the core value of Ren. Ren consists of 5 basic virtues: seriousness, generosity, sincerity, diligence, and kindness. Ren is the virtue of perfectly fulfilling one's responsibilities toward others, most often translated as benevolence, humaneness, or empathy. Translator Arthur Waley calls it goodness, with a capital G, and other translations that have been put forth include authoritativeness and selflessness. Confucius's moral system was based upon empathy and understanding others, rather than divinely ordained rules. To develop one's spontaneous responses of Ren so that these could guide action intuitively was even better than living by the rules of Yi. Confucius asserts that virtue is a mean between extremes. For example, the properly generous person gives the right amount, not too much and not too little. Politics. Confucius's political thought is based upon his ethical thought. He argued that the best government is one that rules through rights, lie, and morality, and not by using incentives and coercion. He explained that this is one of the most important analects. If the people be led by laws and uniformity sought to be given them by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment but have no sense of shame. If they be led by virtue and uniformity sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, they will have the sense of the shame and moreover will become good. Analects 2.3, Tred Lega. This sense of shame is an internalization of duty. Confucianism prioritizes creating a harmonious society over the ruler's interests, opposes material incentives and harsh punishments, and downplays the role of institutions in guiding behavior, as in legalism, emphasizing moral virtues instead. Confucius looked nostalgically upon earlier days and urged the Chinese, particularly those with political power, to model themselves on earlier examples. In times of division, chaos, and endless wars between feudal states, he wanted to restore the mandate of heaven that could unify the world, all under heaven, and bestow peace and prosperity on the people. Because his vision of personal and social perfections was framed as a revival of the ordered society of earlier times, Confucius is often considered a great proponent of conservatism, but a closer look at what he proposes often shows that he used, and perhaps twisted, past institutions and rights to push a new political agenda of his own. A revival of a unified royal state, whose rulers would succeed to power on the basis of their moral merits instead of lineage. These would be rulers devoted to the well-being of their people, striving to be a role model in virtue and ritual, and such a ruler would spread his own virtues to the people instead of imposing proper behavior with laws and edicts. In discussing the relationship between a king and his subject, or a father and his son, he underlined the need to give due respect to superiors. This demanded that the subordinates must advise their superiors if the superiors are considered to be taking a course of action that is wrong. Confucius believed in ruling by example. If you lead correctly, orders by force or punishment are not necessary. Music and poetry. Music was one of the 6 arts that students needed to master, together with archery, charioteering, mathematics, calligraphy, and a partner to music, the purpose of rituals. Confucius heavily promoted the use of music with rituals or the rites order. Unlike other philosophers around the world, Confucius viewed music and music theory beyond a mere art form or curriculum subject. and stated that it was intrinsically intertwined with rites in structuring man. Music is that which moves man from the internal. Rites are that which affects man on the external. Music brings about harmony. Rites ensure obedience. To Confucius, music created the focus necessary to unite and harmonize man. Thus, music and rites together were more than beneficial, but were to make people act in a manner compatible with heaven and earth. The scholar Li Zheho argued that Confucianism is based on the idea of rites. Rites serve as the starting point for each individual, and that these sacred social functions allow each person's human nature to be harmonious with reality. Given this, Confucius believed that music is the harmonization of heaven and earth. The rites is the order of heaven and earth. Therefore, the application of music in rites creates the order that makes it possible for society to prosper. The Confucian approach to music was heavily inspired by the Shijing, or classic of poetry, and the classic of music, which was said to be the sixth Confucian classic until it was lost during the Han Dynasty. The classic of poetry serves as one of the current Confucian classics and is a book on poetry that contains a diversified variety of poems, as well as poems meant for folk songs. Confucius is traditionally ascribed with compiling these classics within his school. In the Analects, Confucius described the importance of poetry in the intellectual and moral development of an individual. Confucians in later generations had conservative and mixed views on international musical influences encroaching on China, in particular those with varying styles that did not traditionally accompany rites, and some preached against sentimental tendencies from the Persians, the Greco-Bactrians, and the Mongols. Legacy. Confucius's teachings were later turned into an elaborate set of rules and practices by his numerous disciples and followers, who organized his teachings into the Analects. Confucius's disciples and his only grandson, Zisi, continued his philosophical school after his death. These efforts spread Confucian ideals to students who then became officials in many of the royal courts in China, thereby giving Confucianism the first wide-scale test of its dogma. Two of Confucius's most famous later followers emphasized radically different aspects of his teachings. In the centuries after his death, Mencius and Sunzi both composed important teachings, elaborating in different ways on the fundamental ideas associated with Confucius. Mencius, 4th century BCE, articulated the innate goodness in human beings as a source of the ethical intuitions that guide people towards Ren, Yi, and Li, while Junzi, 3rd century BCE, underscored the realistic and materialistic aspects of Confucian thought, stressing that morality was inculcated in society through tradition and in individuals through training. In time, their writings, together with the Analects and other core texts, came to constitute the philosophical corpus of Confucianism. Towards the end of the Warring States periods, legalism gained momentum amid the intensified power struggle. Considered an antithesis of Confucian thinking, legalism held that humanity and righteousness were not sufficient in government, and that rulers should instead rely on statecrafts, punishments, vigorous administration of law, and warfare. Legalism seemed to win out over the other school of political thoughts in 221 BCE, when the Qin state conquered all of China and adopted legalism as its official doctrine. Li Si, prime minister of the Qin dynasty, convinced Qin Shi Huang to completely abolish feudal ranks and privileges of the Zhou dynasty and to centralize power through the prefectures and county system. It was not until the Han dynasty that Confucian teachings gained widespread prominence over other thinkers. Under Emperor Wu of Han, the works attributed to Confucius were made the official imperial philosophy and required reading for civil service examinations in 140 BCE, which was continued nearly unbroken until the end of the imperial China in 1912. As Mohism lost support by the time of the Han, the main philosophical contenders were legalism, which Confucian thought somewhat absorbed, the teachings of Laozi, whose focus on more spiritual ideas kept it from direct conflict with Confucianism, and the new Buddhist religion, which gained acceptance during the Southern and Northern dynasties era. Both Confucian ideas and Confucian-trained officials were relied upon in the Ming dynasty and even the Yuan dynasty, although the Mongol rulers somewhat distrusted Confucian scholar officials and excluded them from some of the top government positions. During the Song dynasty, Confucianism was revitalized in a movement known as Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism was a revival of Confucianism that expanded on classical theories by incorporating metaphysics and new approaches to self-cultivation and enlightenment, influenced by Buddhism and Taoism. The most renowned scholar of this period was Zhu Xi. There are clear Buddhist and Taoist influences in the Neo-Confucian advocacy of quiet sitting, meditation, as a technique of self-cultivation that leads to transformative experiences of insight. In his life, Zhu Xi was largely ignored, but not long after his death, his ideas became the new orthodox view of what Confucian texts actually meant. Modern historians view Zhu Xi as having created something rather different and call his way of thinking Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism held sway in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam until the 19th century. The works of Confucius were first translated into European languages by Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century during the late Ming dynasty. The first known effort was by Michel Ruggieri, who returned to Italy in 1588 and carried on his translations while residing in Salerno. Matteo Ricci started to report on the thoughts of Confucius, and a team of Jesuits, Prospero Intorcetta, Philippe Couplet, and two others, published a translation of several Confucian works and an overview of Chinese history in Paris in 1687. François Noël, after failing to persuade Clement XI that Chinese veneration of ancestors and Confucius did not constitute idolatry, completed the Confucian canon at Prague in 1711, with more scholarly treatments of the other works and the first translation of the collected works of Mencius. It is thought that such works had considerable importance on European thinkers of the period, particularly among the deists and other philosophical groups of the Enlightenment, who were interested by the integration of the system of morality of Confucius into Western civilization. In the modern era, Confucian movements, such as New Confucianism, still exist, but during the Cultural Revolution, Confucianism was frequently attacked by leading figures in the Chinese Communist Party. This was partially a continuation of the condemnations of Confucianism by intellectuals and activists in the early 20th century as a cause of the ethnocentric close-mindedness and refusal of the Qing dynasty to modernize that led to the tragedies that befell China in the 19th century. Confucian teachings, values, and practices permeated and influenced East Asian countries, particularly Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, in areas such as education systems, civil service selection, and ethical and social relations. Among Tibetans, Confucius is often worshipped as a holy king and master of magic, divination, and astrology. Tibetan Buddhists see him as learning divination from the Buddha Manjushri, and that knowledge subsequently reaching Tibet through Princess Wencheng, while Bon practitioners see him as being a reincarnation of Tompa Shenrab Miwoche, the legendary founder of Bon. The Ahmadiyya believes Confucius was a divine prophet of God, as were Lao Tzu and other eminent Chinese personages. According to the Siddha tradition of Tamil Nadu, Confucius is one of the 18 esteemed Siddhas of yore and is better known as Kalanginatha or Kamalamuni. The Thyagaraja temple in Thiruvarur, Tamil Nadu, is home to his Jiva Samadhi. In modern times, asteroid 7853, Confucius, was named after the Chinese thinker, teaching and disciples. Confucius was regarded as the first teacher who advocated for public welfare and the spread of education in China. Confucius devoted his entire life, from a relatively young age, to teaching. He pioneered private education, adopting a curriculum known as the Six Arts, aimed at making education accessible to all social classes, and believed in its power to cultivate character rather than merely vocational skills. Confucius not only made teaching his profession, but also contributed to the development of a distinct class of professionals in ancient China. The gentlemen who were neither farmers, artisans, merchants, nor officials, but instead dedicated themselves to teaching and potential government service. Confucius began teaching after he turned 30 and taught more than 3,000 students in his life, about 70 of whom were considered outstanding. His disciples and the early Confucian community they formed became the most influential intellectual force in the Warring States period. The Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian dedicated a chapter in his Records of the Grand Historian to the biographies of Confucius's disciples, accounting for the influence they exerted in their time and afterward. Sima Qian recorded the names of 77 disciples in his collective biography, while Kongzi Jiayu, another early source, records 76, not completely overlapping. The two sources together yield the names of 96 disciples. 22 of them are mentioned in the Analects, while the Mencius records 24. Confucius did not charge any tuition and only requested a symbolic gift of a bundle of dried meat from any prospective student. According to his disciple Zigong, his master treated students like doctors treated patients and did not turn anybody away. Most of them came from Lu, Confucius's home state, with 43 recorded, but he accepted students from all over China, with 6 from the state of Wei, such as Zigong, 3 from Qin, 2 each from Chen and Qi, and 1 each from Kai, Chu, and Song. Confucius considered his students' personal background irrelevant and accepted noblemen, commoners, and even former criminals such as Yan Zhuoju and Gong Yechang. His disciples from richer families would pay a sum commensurate with their wealth, which was considered a ritual donation. Confucius's favorite disciple was Yan Hui, most probably one of the most impoverished of them all. Sima Niu, in contrast to Yan Hui, was from a hereditary noble family hailing from the Song state. Under Confucius's teachings, the disciples became well learned in the principles and methods of government. He often engaged in discussion and debate with his students and gave high importance to their studies in history, poetry, and ritual. Confucius advocated loyalty to principle rather than to individual acumen, in which reform was to be achieved by persuasion rather than violence. Even though Confucius denounced them for their practices, the aristocracy was likely attracted to the idea of having trustworthy officials who were studied in morals, as the circumstances of the time made it desirable. In fact, the disciple Zilu even died defending his ruler in Wei. Yang Hu, who was a subordinate of the Ji family, had dominated the Lu government from 505 to 502 and even attempted a coup, which narrowly failed. As a likely consequence, it was after this that the first disciples of Confucius were appointed to government positions. A few of Confucius's disciples went on to attain official positions of some importance, some of which were arranged by Confucius. By the time Confucius was 50 years old, the Ji family had consolidated their power in the Lu state over the ruling ducal house. Even though the Ji family had practices with which Confucius disagreed and disapproved, they nonetheless gave Confucius's disciples many opportunities for employment. Confucius continued to remind his disciples to stay true to their principles and renounce those who did not, all the while being openly critical of the Ji family. In the West, the influence of Confucius has been observed on multiple Western thinkers, including Niels Bohr, Benjamin Franklin, Allen Ginsberg, Thomas Jefferson, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Robert Cummings Neville, Alexander Pope, Ezra Pound, François Quesnay, Friedrich Schiller, Voltaire, and Christian Wolff. Visual portraits. No contemporary painting or sculpture of Confucius survives, and it was only during the Han Dynasty that he was portrayed visually. Carvings often depict his legendary meeting with Laozi. Since that time, there have been many portraits of Confucius as the ideal philosopher. An early verbal portrayal of Confucius is found in the chapter External Things, Waiwu, of the book Zhuangzi, finished in about 3rd BCE, long after Confucius's death. The oldest known portrait of Confucius has been unearthed in the tomb of the Han Dynasty ruler Marquis of Haihun, died 59 BCE. The picture was painted on the wooden frame to a polished bronze mirror. In former times, it was customary to have a portrait in Confucius temples. However, during the reign of Hongwu Emperor Taizu of the Ming Dynasty, it was decided that the only proper portrait of Confucius should be in the temple in his hometown, Khufu, in Shandong. In other temples, Confucius is represented by a memorial tablet. In 2006, the China Confucius Foundation commissioned a standard portrait of Confucius based on the Tang Dynasty portrait by Wu Daozi. The south wall frieze in the courtroom of the Supreme Court of the United States depicts Confucius as a teacher of harmony, learning, and virtue. Fictional portrayals. There have been 2 film adaptations of Confucius's life: the 1940 film Confucius starring Tang Huaiqiu, and the 2010 film Confucius starring Chow Yun-fat. Confucius appears as a leader in Civilization the Seventh, leading China. Memorials. Throughout the imperial periods, Khufu, Confucius's birthplace and burial site, remained a place of devotion and reverence. The records of the Grand Historian records the first state sacrifice by Emperor Gaozu of Han at Confucius's tomb, followed by worship of ministers, dukes, and scholar politicians. From the Tang Dynasty onward, temples honoring Confucius and Confucian sages were erected across the country by imperial decree. These temples have been used for ceremonies paying tribute to Confucius as the master of teachers, as well as the Confucian virtues that have shaped the Chinese civilization. When the communist regime took control of mainland China in 1949, this tradition was interrupted for at least 3 decades during the Maoist era in the campaign purging the Four Olds, and the subsequent campaign denouncing Lin Biao and Confucius. The official stance of the Chinese Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution was that Confucius and Confucianism represented reactionary ideologies of the slave-owning aristocracy. All Confucian ceremonies and rites were therefore banned, and Confucius' tomb attacked by the Red Guards. In the early 1980s, the anti-Confucius sentiments were over, and Confucius veneration was resumed with communist officials in attendance. By the 21st century, Confucius's birthday in Khufu becomes a week-long celebration attended by diplomats, scholars, and government representatives. In Taiwan, where the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, strongly promoted Confucian beliefs in ethics and behavior, the tradition of the memorial ceremony of Confucius is supported by the government and has continued without interruption. In May 2025, Confucius's birthday, September 28th, previously designated as Teacher Day, was made a public holiday by legislation. In South Korea, a grand-scale memorial ceremony called Seokjeon Daeje is held twice a year on Confucius's birthday and the anniversary of his death, at Confucian academies across the country, and Sungkyunkwan in Seoul. Descendants. Confucius's descendants were repeatedly identified and honored by successive imperial governments with titles of nobility and official posts. They were honored with the rank of a marquis 35 times since Gaozu of the Han dynasty, and they were promoted to the rank of duke 42 times from the Tang dynasty to the Qing dynasty. Emperor Xuanzong of Tang first bestowed the title of Duke Wenxuan on Kong Suiji of the 35th generation. In 1055, Emperor Renzong of Song first bestowed the title of Duke Yansheng on Kong Zongyuan of the 46th generation. During the southern Song dynasty, the Duke Yansheng Kong Duanyu fled south with the Song Emperor to Kuzhou in Zhejiang, while the newly established Jin dynasty, 1115–1234, in the north, appointed Kong Duanyu's brother Kong Duankao, who remained in Khufu as Duke Yansheng. From that time up until the Yuan dynasty, there were 2 Duke Yanshengs, one in the north in Khufu, and the other in the south at Kuzhou. An invitation to come back to Khufu was extended to the southern Duke Yansheng Kongju by the Yuan dynasty Emperor Kublai Khan. The title was taken away from the southern branch after Kongju rejected the invitation, so the northern branch of the family kept the title of Duke Yansheng. The southern branch remained in Kuzhou, where they live to this day. Confucius's descendants in Kuzhou alone number 30,000. The Hanlin Academy rank of Wujing Boshi was awarded to the southern branch at Kuzhou by a Ming emperor, while the northern branch at Khufu held the title Duke Yansheng. The leader of the southern branch was Kong Xiangkai. In 1351, during the reign of Emperor Togon Temur of the Yuan dynasty, 54th generation Kong Shao moved from China to Korea during the Goryeo dynasty and was received courteously by Princess Noguk, the Mongolian-born queen consort of the future King Gongmin. After being naturalized as a subject of Goryeo, he changed the hanja of his name from to, both pronounced so in Korean, married a Korean woman and bore a son, Gongyeo, 1329–1397, therefore establishing the Changwon Gong clan, whose ancestral seat was located in Changwon, South Gyeongsang Province. In 1794, during the reign of King Zhongzhou, the clan then changed its name to Gokbu Gong clan in honor of Confucius's birthplace, Khufu, RR Gokbu. Famous descendants include actors such as Gong Yu, real name Gongji Cheol, and Gong Hyo Jin, and artists such as male idol group B1A4 member Gongchan, real name Gongchan Sik, singer-songwriter Minzi, real name Gong Minji, as well as her great-aunt, traditional folk dancer Gong Okujin. Despite repeated dynastic change in China, the title of Duke Yansheng was bestowed upon successive generations of descendants until it was abolished by the nationalist government in 1935. The last holder of the title, Kung Tae Cheng of the 77th generation, was appointed sacrificial official to Confucius. Kung Tae Cheng died in October 2008, and his son, Kung Wei Yi, the 78th lineal descendant, died in 1989. Kung Tae Cheng's grandson, Kung Tsui Chang, the 79th lineal descendant, was born in 1975. His great-grandson, Kung Yu Zhen, the 80th lineal descendant, was born in Taipei on 1 January 2006. Taicheng's sister, Kong de Mao, lives in mainland China and has written a book about her experiences growing up at the family estate in Khufu. Another sister, Kong Deki, died as a young woman. Many descendants of Confucius still live in Khufu today. A descendant of Confucius, H. Kung, was the premier of the Republic of China. One of his sons, Kong Lingji, married Deborah Paget, who gave birth to Gregory Kung. Confucius's family, the Kongs, have the longest recorded extant pedigree in the world today. The father-to-son family tree, now in its 83rd generation, has been recorded since the death of Confucius. According to the Confucius Genealogy Compilation Committee, CGCC, he has 2 million known and registered descendants, and there are an estimated 3 million in all. Of these, several tens of thousands live outside of China. In the 14th century, a Kong descendant went to Korea, where an estimated 34,000 descendants of Confucius live today. One of the main lineages fled from the Kong ancestral home in Khufu during the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s and eventually settled in Taiwan. There are also branches of the Kong family who have converted to Islam after marrying Muslim women, in Dachuan, in Gansu province in the 1800s, and in 1715 in Xuanwei, in Yunnan province. Many of the Muslim Confucius descendants are descended from the marriage of Ma Jiaga, a Muslim woman, and Kong Yanrong, 59th generation descendant of Confucius in the year 1480, and are found among the Hui and Dongxiang peoples. The new genealogy includes the Muslims. Kong Dejun is a prominent Islamic scholar and Arabist from Qinghai province and a 77th generation descendant of Confucius. Because of the huge interest in the Confucius family tree, there was a project in China to test the DNA of known family members of the collateral branches in mainland China. Among other things, this would allow scientists to identify a common Y chromosome in male descendants of Confucius. If the descent were truly unbroken, father to son, since Confucius's lifetime, the males in the family would all have the same Y chromosome as their direct male ancestor, with slight mutations due to the passage of time. The aim of the genetic test was to help members of collateral branches in China who lost their genealogical records to prove their descent. However, in 2009, many of the collateral branches decided not to agree to DNA testing. Brian Sykes, professor of genetics at Oxford University, understands this decision. The Confucius family tree has an enormous cultural significance. It's not just a scientific question. The DNA testing was originally proposed to add new members, many of whose family record books were lost during 20th century upheavals, to the Confucian family tree. The main branch of the family which fled to Taiwan was never involved in the proposed DNA test at all. In 2013, a DNA test performed on multiple different families who claimed descent from Confucius found that they shared the same Y chromosome as reported by Fudan University. The fifth and most recent edition of the Confucius genealogy was printed by the CGCC. It was unveiled in a ceremony at Khufu on 24th of September 2009. Women are now included for the first time. Criticism. During the Cultural Revolution. During the Cultural Revolution, criticism of Confucius increased, coming to a head when Red Guard soldiers removed the body of Kong Jingyi, a 76th generation Duke Yansheng, from his grave at the cemetery of Confucius. His body was then hung naked from a tree. Anti-Confucian sentiment continued to increase in 1973, when Mao Zedong started a Criticize Lin, Criticize Confucius, simplified traditional, Pinyin, Pi Lin, Pi Kong Yundong, campaign, branding Confucius with the name Kong Lao Er, a pun on a Mandarin word for penis. It persisted until 1976, as the Cultural Revolution subsided. During this time, Confucius was perceived as a reflection of Xia and Zhou dynasty slave-driving practice, specifically by promoting the upkeep of the rights of Zhou, which itself involved the keeping of slave. He was seen as complicit in its persistence across the ages. This position was justified through entries in records of the Grand Historian. With this context, the Spring and Autumn Annals attributed to Confucius were seen as his attempt to defend the state of Lu as a slave state. Furthermore, the execution of Xiao Zhengmao was seen as a reflection of bourgeois power games, the charges against the minister being seen as trumped up. It was from this that Confucian principles such as Ren and Zhong were abstracted as symbols of elitism. That's the complete article. If you made it this far, you'll love the rest of the channel. Subscribe for a new Wikipedia deep dive every single day. The next video is on screen now, and if there's a topic you want narrated, drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching.